So we're going to start the transition into some of the more applicable in terms of tangible things that you will be asked to do. So again, if you want to follow along in your binder, and I suggest you do for the next couple of slides, I'm going to reference a lot of different materials. If you flip to the administrative responsibilities section, and just to give you a heads up, we're going to talk about communication, your grant agreement, the assurances, items that require prior approvals, and we'll also talk about the audit component as well. So in terms of communication, we always like to kind of start kind of with the bare bones stuff. And I know that we have representation in the room from providers and different partners. So I want to first off say thank you so much for being here. But in terms of the day-to-day communication, our team is primarily going to communicate with the folks who the BSCC has a grant agreement contract with. So I want you to hear that directly from us now so that you're not upset with your project staff. If you feel like you're being left out of something, you can blame me now. We do that intentionally, however. It can go great when you want it to, or it can go sideways really quickly. And there's nothing worse than someone who means really, really well, but did not talk to you before, contacting our staff and having this great suggestion. And we are under the auspice that you two have signed off on it, and we approve it, and then you come back and you're not very happy with us. So you learn a lot from experience. And so just know that up front, that's what that will mean. Now, to that end, in that admin section, there is something called a grantee contact information sheet. These are things I want you to be familiar with because they will be important relatively soon. Once this document is completed, and again, this is by you, I can see you all flipping. So admin responsibilities, right behind the PowerPoint, the first attachment. So once that's completed, that will include the list of folks that our team knows it's okay to communicate with. And so this is primarily generated based on your proposal, and I think for some of you, you may have already submitted a revised document to Callie via email at some point. I would certainly highlight, star this page. Once completed, if your staff name, again, is not on this document, we'll politely ask them to reach out to the project director to have him or her complete that document. So please make sure that that is accurate. The one exception I will make to our communication rule is from time to time we do speak directly with your project evaluators. When that occurs, it's typically because something is due. Usually there's some reports which we're going to talk about in a little bit, or if we have an evaluator-specific conference call. And what we'll typically do is when we do have calls, we will either CC folks that are listed as the lead staff or on our project calls themselves, which we'll talk about that as well. We'll let you know about the topics that we plan to discuss in advance. And if it gives you any level of comfort on those calls, if there's at any point any discussion about maybe changing a proposal or doing something that maybe the project staff aren't aware of, we certainly ask them to reach out to the project director as our kind of our default position. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't value the input that the evaluators have, but we want to be really clear about who we're taking guidance from. And we don't know all the dynamics that are at play locally, and so we would hate to approve something that perhaps you may have a different view on. Okay, so for the next few slides, in that same section, if you pull up your grant agreement, there's a sample one that's in there for you. And again, it'll be right behind that grantee contact information sheet. Just for reference, it's on your screen. Okay. So if you just flip through the first two pages of the sample agreement that we have in there for you, I want to point your attention to Exhibit A and Exhibit B. Exhibit A includes your reporting dates. Especially for those of you that are brand new, please write them down, save them, whatever makes the most sense for you. Now, again, all of this has been provided to you electronically in your grant agreement. So again, the takeaway here is just to look for Exhibit A and Exhibit B. Be mindful of that. I do want to flag 4 things for you right away. So as you know, the grant began on August 15, 2019. So I'm looking at line item 1 on the screen, just in terms of a reference. So your first progress report period covers August 15 through December 31. However, your first progress report is not due until February 15 of 2020. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later on, but just be mindful of that. And if you go below, again, this is still in your Exhibit A, and you look at the evaluation reports, I do want to flag that your first deliverable is due on December 31, 2019, not January 1, 2020, or January 5, 2020, but December 31, 2019. Again, later on today, Stacey is going to talk about these elements a little bit more. So for now, all I will say is time moves really quickly, and please start thinking about these things that are up here sooner rather than later. In your binder, if you look at Exhibit B, it's alphabetical, follows right after Exhibit A. Things I want to flag for you. You'll see it includes the cycle, the grant cycle, and the first one says monthly invoicing periods. So again, when our staff first reached out to you, you most likely received a communication from Callie asking you if you wanted to bill the grant or seek reimbursement on a monthly or quarterly basis. Know that your grant agreement will reflect whatever has been selected, and that is what it will be for the duration of the grant period. So you're locked in. But again, just the things to kind of flag. The first monthly invoice period covers August through September of 2019, with the first invoice report due on November 15. And again, after I've concluded this section, my colleagues Julie and Deanna will talk you through where your invoices are and how to complete that submission process. And then again, in that sample, on the very next page for Exhibit B, you can see the quarterly reporting periods. And again, for the quarterly reporting periods, that covers August through December 2019. And similar to the progress report, it's also due on February the 15th to 2020. So again, the takeaway from this being, please review your grant agreements, extract those key dates, and plan accordingly. The other thing I would flag, it doesn't pop up here, but it's just a feature of the RFP that we developed based on some really good feedback from Cohort 1. The grant has an implementation period that in essence begins from August 15th through December 31. If your grant program is ready to go can mean different things to each of you, but if you're ready to begin service delivery, once we've told you that we've signed your contract, you've signed your contract, that's it. You don't need to wait for the implementation period to conclude if you are ready to go. However, our experience in the first round, many of you have something called a procurement contracting process, which makes our process look expeditious. And unfortunately, although we try to build in as much time as we can, we recognize that it may help you, but it may not cover as much as possible. But I did want to acknowledge, again, especially for the Cohort 1 folks that are here, that we certainly did hear that input about the need for kind of a startup period, and that's about the implementation period. So what could you do? It's really up to you. Ideally, if you need to release your own local RFP, if you need to train folks, if you need to get staff hired, all the things that go into getting your grant started, that's what those first 6 months are for. And our expectation is that come January 1, 2020, that everyone is providing services. That's really helpful for us because when we talk about recidivism and having some kind of clean dates, having a clean start and end date is of ideal preference. Again, I acknowledge that for some of you that you may still run into some hurdles, but know that we have tried to accommodate that a little bit better this time around. So earlier, I showed you some pictures of the Cohort 2 Executive Steering Committee, or the scoring panel. And so now I'm going to talk really briefly about conflict of interest. So as members of the body that help to read and rate your proposals, they also agreed to not receive any financial benefit from the process, because that would be awkward if they've said that this is the best proposal, and oh, by the way, they're going to provide me $500,000. Part of the agreement, however, is that, again, they won't benefit from it. But the reason I'm really flagging this for you is that the non-governmental organizations in particular are prohibited from receiving any grant dollars. The prohibition does not extend to those public agencies. It's just the way it's written into code. But the non-governmental organizations may not receive funding from you or your providers if they subcontract. So what does that mean? So for example, if I'm looking at the list, I guess behind me in your case, so on line 3, where it says to the right of it under title and organization, it says EC Consultant. Below it, Victor Family Resource Center. If I skip down to line 7, Leadership for Educational Equity. Down to line 9, the Place for Grace. Line 10, Life Community Development. I believe that's it. So those organizations, and again, they've already agreed to it, but what I'm more so concerned about is that as your sub-providers do business, that they also are aware of this. So long story short, please consult this list when you are further subcontracting, or if you're providing service delivery directly yourself. And again, that prohibition does not apply to the governmental organizations that are listed. Any questions about that? Great. So our office does offer a wide array of grant programs. And so I just want to be clear that this is a reimbursement grant. Hope that you know that through the application process. I hope no one's surprised. There will not be a check in the mail. We do have other grant programs where that is a feature, but to be clear, that's not the case for Prop 47, Cohort 1 or 2. So in essence, you will be reimbursed for actual expenditures that are claimed. And what that really means is you need to document any items that you're billing to the grant. And what does that mean even more? Big picture, whatever you provided in your proposal budget that you were able to quantify, we want to just see that you're tracking it. And we're going to circle back to that a little bit later as well. Okay, so let's keep in your appendix. If you go to Exhibit D, and I do want you to do this because it's one of the first things we end up covering on site visits. So again, in that same section, Exhibit D, and it will say special terms and conditions on the top of it. Especially those of you where maybe your contracting staff may not be present, or your fiscal staff may not be present. Please make sure you document this portion in particular. So your grant agreement with the BSCC, I believe all of you have already signed, includes this language. So I always like to kind of start there. So there's nothing here, what I'm about to talk about, that we're asking you to put in that you have not already agreed to. What we're more so asking you to do is to ensure that this language is also in your contracts with your providers. So again, you've already signed off on this, but we want to make sure that your providers also have this language in their contract. So what is this language? And you can read it verbatim, but really at a high level, it ensures that the state has access to your facility, that we have access to your records. It does not assume, so it states, in fact, that you should be documenting all of your expenses. So it's not enough to say, oh, we have the grant, just trust me, we have it. Like, no, you have to also document it. And so again, you have to flag things that do occur, but the takeaway being that, look through that section, but these are things that should be in your agreements with your providers. The other thing that's in there too, I will also flag, I think it gets overlooked. There is verbiage that requires that you maintain documentation for a minimum of 3 years after the grant concludes. So that's program, fiscal, data. And again, remember that extends to your subcontractors. Now, many of you, your city, county, school district process is significantly longer. I've met quite a few of you where you have a 5 to 7 or a 7 to 10 year requirement. You're already covered. Again, the takeaway being that your provider should also be made aware of this as well. Okay, so let's talk about assurances. So the very last handout in that section, because it will be easier for you to view it that way, it says Appendix B at the very top of it. It says the grantee assurance for third-party non-governmental organizations. This is a really important document, and it also comes into play on your site visit, so we'll spend just a few minutes on this. So as part of your application process, one of the things that you agree to is that all of the providers that you intend to do business with, and ergo the state of California will do business with, have all the appropriate licensures and documentation to do business. So for example, they have a valid business license, if it's required, any other kind of local documentation as well. They must have a physical address. So for those of you that have had site visits with me where I insist on driving all over the county with you, part of why we need to make sure that they're not shell organizations. And I appreciate all of you who've taken many long car rides with me. Other things to note is that this assurance applies to your non-governmental organizations in particular. So if you have governmental organizations, again, the rules are not applicable there. And the takeaway being that we want you to maintain documentation on site. And again, we've bulleted out them for you, and I'm going to show you a specific place that you can check, at least one component that I always check at a minimum on our visits as well. The Secretary of State's website, and again, if it's easier, we can send this to you as well. But you can check to ensure that folks have some active registered licenses. So on a site visit, this is probably one of the very first things I'll ask you to do is just to produce something that shows me that the providers, again, are registered and licensed to do business in the state of California. If they are not, we will most likely have different conversations regarding any expenses that are billed to the grant where the entity does not meet those requirements. So again, this is just one place that you can check. And again, if your city, county, school district has any other requirements that have been deemed necessary for someone to do business in your city, school district, et cetera, you should also have that information available as well. And again, I'll note that before we do a site visit, we'll kind of prep you on this stuff as well, but it's to your advantage to do it now. As you bring providers on, as all of your paperwork is official, certainly update this information. And then the only other thing I'll say about the assurance is every time you add new providers, please provide us an updated version of this document as well, because we need it for auditing purposes as well. Okay, my favorite topic, incentives, food. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to approach this topic. So I'll try to go with the canned version that I give all of our existing sites. In theory, the items that are on that screen there are allowable, in theory. However, you do need to do some work with us before we will allow them. And in some instances, we may tell you no, even if it's in your grant approved budget. So we'll kind of go through what that means right now. And so it might be the one time I'll actually read truly from my notes. So if your grant approved budget includes, for example, food and beverages, gift cards, incentives, that means different things to all of you. So just think of it in its most broad sense. Let's just start with those first three. We will require a written justification. Your justification should include the following, and yes, I will provide this to you by email at a later date. So the name of your provider, if that's the entity that's requesting it, the amount of grant funds that would be dedicated to the incentive. You should list out all of the incentives within reason, of course. So for example, if it's clothing, if it's toiletries, if it's work boots, et cetera, et cetera. The justification should also include an approximate number of participants that would benefit from it. And then at the very end, or some version of it, there should be an actual justification that explains why you need the things that you are requesting. So again, we need a written justification before you purchase, before you go too far down that road. We need it for auditing purposes, and it kind of serves both purposes for us and for you. It helps us to understand when we come on site visits what we have signed off on so that we know what to check. And it helps you ensure that your providers are only purchasing things that are, within the framework that you deem to be appropriate. So if we approve your justification, the second part is we're going to ask you to track it. And I'm going to use the word you globally. Globally meaning it could be you, the actual site. It could be that you have your provider or each of your providers track it. So again, using the word you globally, but just know that on a site visit, I will be asking the agency that we have the agreement with for that information, and then you can kind of work with your providers to go back and forth. So your log should include the type of incentive, if it has an incentive number. So for example, if it's a gift card, if you can track the gift card number, the name of the client who received the incentive, the date it was distributed, a signature of the person, the signature of the client that received the incentive, a staff person maybe sign off on it, and a supervisor's signature. And again, we'll share all this with you. There are things that we think are kind of the common sense checks, so to speak. We just want to make sure that we know where it's going and for what purpose. So those are the first three. If your proposal, let me backtrack. On food and beverages, and all the existing cohorts already know this, must only be used for grant-funded participants. So even if there's a really compelling case for someone, but they're not a participant on the grant, it will be disallowed. It can't be used for your staff meetings. It has to be something specifically for clients, which is, again, why we ask for that justification. If you want to use other funding streams to do your meetings, events, have at it, but know that that's going to be one of the kind of firm things for grant funds related to food. If your proposal includes a request for a vehicle, be it for a purchase or for a lease, know that we have different criteria that we ask you to demonstrate. It's some version of you have to document that it's the least expensive option more than anything else. And again, there'll be a justification language that's required as well. And again, we'll share that with you. And then the last thing I want to flag on this is out-of-state travel is extremely rarely, if ever, approved. Our governor doesn't let us travel out-of-state that often, and when we do, it's maybe one at most. And on top of that, the Attorney General has generated a list of states that we are prohibited from flying with using certain funding streams, including our grant funds. If you travel to one of those states, you can pull it up from the AG's office. I can just tell you now that we won't reimburse you. I believe Texas, North Carolina, there's a few other states that we're privy to, I believe, some bathroom banning language. And so just know if I tell you no, I can cite where it's from, and that's what we're referring to. Questions? Yes, absolutely. So we do have a grant administration guide that you can find on our website. We intentionally did not provide hard copies to you as we are in the midst of a series of updates to a lot of sections. So if you can for now, if you just keep the link more than anything else, you will have the most detailed information and updated information. And we'll also, at some point, have some quarterly calls, and we'll also kind of dive through some of what that means as well. But again, we do have it available for you. We're just in the midst of some significant revisions. And then the last thing I'll just touch on here is there is an audit component that comes with the grant. So if an audit is conducted, it does not come from our office, although I've been told our site visits might feel like an audit, but it's not. Our site visits are very detailed, a very, very detailed review, we think, to help you prepare for what an audit might look like. The audit, if it is conducted, comes through the Office of the Comptroller. There is no special design to how you're selected. It doesn't mean you were late that one time with a progress report. It's independent of us. We have nothing to do with it other than we're notified that someone's been selected for an audit. The audit may come directly to you as the lead agency, or they could, in theory, go to providers, which is why we've spent so much time trying to ask you that you document things in as great detail as possible. Things that they are, from what we can gather, interested in is documented policies and procedures, right? So all the things that you guys should have anyway. The format of it has not really been so much so an issue, so much so as that their program, fiscal policies and procedures, that the staff can explain them, that you're following them, and that, again, you can tie any incentives or any expenses that can be supported. And so, again, these are things that we've been tracking or trying to assist you with on site visits. So, for example, if you've purchased something for $3,000, can you provide documentation that supports that amount? If you can do that, it goes much quickly. If you cannot, it's a bit of an awkward conversation with them, from what I can understand. But I'm sure that makes sense to all of you. And I'll also note that if you are selected for an audit, that the BSCC staff are not there. We volunteered to be there, and we were voluntold that it's not necessary. So to the extent that we can, it seems like we've been able to kind of every time we talk with them get a little bit more. We'll share with you as much as we are allowed to share with you. And as we know more information, we'll make that available. Any questions? Great. So just some takeaways. Follow your grant agreement. If all else fails, that's the place where you can go. Again, we've provided a sample for you, but you have the actual thing electronically. I believe there are a few of you that are still waiting for your board resolutions. Please just keep bugging whoever you need to bug to kind of get that process going. But I certainly understand that it's out of your control. But once we have all that stuff officially, then we can get some other things going as well. Maintain an updated non-governmental assurance. Again, we provided one for you at the end of the folder. We'll share that stuff electronically as well. That list of items that I showed you always requires prior approval. We'll only do it at the beginning of the grant, so it won't be every single time. But if we have it at the beginning, that's great. If you, however, then add additional incentives, obviously we'll certainly kind of repeat